All right. Hi, everyone. Back to teach another class. Let's let people in from the reading room. All right. Hi, everyone. We'll get started shortly. Just going to wait until everybody gets here.
Good evening.
Good evening. I trust everybody had a nice, relaxing, long weekend.
I did, but then I realized how much work I have to do after this week ended, and I was just like, oh crap. But
yeah, that was me.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, most people are here, so we'll share the screen. All right. Whoops. Where'd my slides go? There we go. Now, what time is it? Oh, it's just about time to get started. All right. All right, so I suppose we'll begin. Well, thankfully, this is another case of one of those chapters that's a little bit less dense than what we're used to, which is kind of nice. And that said, I know everybody's just coming off of the long weekend, so things will probably be relatively light today and hopefully relatively light next time as well. It's not that dense of a chapter, but this chapter is interesting because it does ask us to think back to some of the earlier chapters and some of the quote unquote dialectical thickets that we've wandered through in this class, right? So a couple of the things that we'll want to recall so that we have these things in mind as we proceed through this chapter are the following. Firstly, I'll draw your attention to the fact that in the last chapter, we learned about value judgments. What are evaluative judgments? What do they have to do with emotions? One of the things that we learned was that there are undoubtedly connections between evaluative judgments and emotions, but the authors have not quite got to the point where they're able to flesh out this connection fully, right? So we're on the right track. That's where we are. Emotions do seem to have something to do with evaluative properties and value judgments. We're just not sure what exactly this looks like yet. And recall further back to, say, chapter 3, we've also talked a lot about desire so far. So desire is, desire is a propositional attitude. It is also a conative state, which means it's motivational. It leads us to do things. And there are a few theories that think of desires as playing a prominent role in the emotions. And of course they do. But some of the ways that they've been thought to play roles, or some of the roles they've been thought to play in the emotions must be wrong, right? Like in the mixed theory, for example, we thought about, in the mixed theory, we learned that people think of desires as constitutive of emotions, right? Desire is actually part of the emotion, because on the mixed theory, emotions are combinations of beliefs and desires. And we saw that, there are some nice advantages to this at a first pass. For example, it gives us a nice way of talking about the emotions that fits within our kind of folk psychological way of, just thinking about other people in general, our folk theorizing in our everyday lives about what people are thinking, or why they're doing what they're doing, why they're behaving, how they're behaving, and so on and so forth. So it's very appealing on a first pass, but it's also problematic. And we saw that because desires, there's a missing link in the chain there. If we're talking about emotions in terms of belief, desire, psychology, as we are in the mixed theory, we need a way from getting, to use the example of Jonas and the snarling dog, to get from, the belief that Jonas believes the dog is snarling at him to a desire to avoid danger. There's something missing there. There's a missing link. The mixed theory doesn't really account for that. And thinking of desires as antecedents to emotions also poses problems for the other account that we looked at in chapter 3, which was the desire, satisfaction, frustration approach. And this, of course, is the approach that sees emotions as representing how our desires fare, right? Thinking of them as antecedent to emotions is problematic as well. So desires, we've talked a lot about desires, so we'll leave it there for now. But also, what we want to do is individuate different emotion types, right? We want to individuate them in the sense that, okay, we can say that this emotional episode is an instance of fear and this one is an instance of sadness. We want to be able to say how and why that is. We have a problem doing that with desires. We also run into problems when we try to individuate emotions via beliefs. Actually, this belief question is something that we're going to talk about a little bit more as we get into things today. So I won't seek examples from everybody just yet, but just know that individuating emotions on the basis of belief is also difficult. Not to get too far ahead of myself, part of the reason why all of these approaches are problematic is because they sort of neglect the phenomenology of emotions, which is kind of like important because emotions are things that we feel, of course. So we've seen these problems with the mixed theory, the desire, frustration, satisfaction approach. Now, we're going to see these problems rear their head again in the theory. Really, it's like a family of theories, I suppose, that we're going to be considering today. I believe at some point the authors call this the classical theory. This is something that we catch glimpses of in some ancient philosophy. The version that the authors start off talking about with, I believe, is something we encounter when we look at Stoic schools of thought. And some of the modifications they make to the theory that we'll talk about next time. We can also see glimpses of that in the work of thinkers like Aristotle. So it's an old theory that's made of a bit of a comeback, and it's called the evaluative judgment theory. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Emotions as value judgments. Well, that is the evaluative judgment theory, or as I will sort of refer to it, EJT. Now, according to EJT, or the evaluative judgment theory, emotions are reducible to what we call doxastic phenomena. Doxastic phenomena, particularly, the kinds that we're particularly concerned with are axiological or evaluative beliefs. Now, there's a lot of new terminology here. We've talked about evaluative properties, value judgments, right? We're kind of familiar with those. We haven't really talked about doxastic states, and we have not talked at all about axiology. So what I want to do before we get too far into this is just make sure that we're all sort of on the same page with what these terms mean. So I wonder, let's start with doxastic phenomena. What is a doxastic phenomena? Does anybody know? Okay, there's an answer in the chat. Let's check it out. Ah, no. Okay, that's all right. Okay, so nobody knows what doxastic stuff is, unless, oh no, just a chuckle. Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. That's why I'm here. So doxastic, the word doxastic comes from the ancient Greek doxa, which means belief, right? And you can do a little not entomology, etymology. You can do a little etymology and see this elsewhere in the English language, right? Like think of a word like orthodoxy. It has that dox, the same root as doxa, orthodoxy, which has to do with, you know, what you're supposed to believe, what the correct beliefs are, you know, in, for example, religion, right? So doxa is ancient Greek for belief. So doxastic states have to do with beliefs. Now you might think, oh, that's pretty straightforward because we've already talked about a type of state that concerns belief, right? And what are the kinds of states, mental states that we've already talked about, you know, that tell us about beliefs and desires? We understand beliefs and desires as a certain kind of state in folk psychological thinking. I'm wondering if anyone can recall what this is. This is a lot easier, by the way. Let's see if anyone, okay. Mind to world. Well, that's direction of fit, which is important for telling us what type of mental state we're dealing with, right? But I'll explain. Remember propositional attitudes. Right. Yes, exactly. So propositional attitudes include things like beliefs, right? So we know that propositional attitudes are attitudes we take toward propositions. Propositions are statements about the world that can have a truth value, right? They can be true or they can be false. And if I take the attitude of belief toward a proposition that says P, then we say that I believe that P. Now that's kind of how we talk about things in, you know, again, like common sense psychology, right? But doxastic states are something are similar, but it's something we do in formal systems. So doxastic states, like belief is a doxastic state, it's also a propositional attitude. But if I treat it as a doxastic state, what I'm probably doing is doing some kind of like logical calculus, right? I'm going to say, like, you know, I want to say that Josh believes that P. Well, if I'm just kind of wandering around through the world doing my everyday folk psychological kind of thing, I can talk about that in terms of propositional attitudes. But if I'm doing logic and working with some kind of formal system like modal logic deals with possibility, right? And the doxastic thing is like a modal modifier in logic. Don't worry too much about these details. Just know that doxastic phenomena are more rigorous. Propositional attitudes are a lot more like what has to do with what's going on in the world. What do I think that you believe or that you desire, right? But doxastic states are more about like the formal systems. And of course, there's a map, you know, formal systems map onto the world, right? You know, and that's why propositions have truth value. But doxastic states are treated a little more rigorously. Propositional attitudes are kind of fast and loose. Doxastic are formal, and there's something we talk about in logic. So does that make sense to everybody? Okay. How about axiology? We've already, like I said, we've talked about evaluative beliefs. Evaluative beliefs, right? Like a belief that we arrive at upon making a value judgment. That's pretty straightforward. Like, I believe that the painting is admirable, right? That's an evaluative belief. If I'm talking about like, I have it right now in the real world, that's a propositional attitude. But if I were to do some kind of logic to describe how I've evaluated the painting and that kind of thing, then that would be more doxastic. But what about axiological? What is axiology? Well, oh,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think it's like you're studying kind of like the wordiness of something, right?
The worthiness?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, axiology is really all about what's good in life, what is meaningful in life. It's closely tied to ethics. And it's something that I think a lot of people attribute Socrates really getting Socrates. It's one of the things that he kind of kicked off, right? The unexamined life is not worth living, right? That's an axiological kind of statement. So what is meaningful, what is worth something, and how we make those evaluations. These are the particular kinds of doxastic states that the authors concern themselves with in this chapter. Or rather, these are the kinds of states that the evaluative judgment theory concerns itself with. So what is the evaluative judgment theory? Well, before I explain, let's recall some examples from chapter 3. I know that I've altered these examples slightly throughout within my lectures. So here's the original version, right? There we had examples of the mixed theory and the desire, satisfaction, frustration approach, where we tried to attribute emotions based on beliefs, right? So Jonas has a belief that the dog is snarling. And that is somehow causally related to his coming to feel afraid, right? Mary's belief that her cat is injured is related in an important way to her emotional response, to her sadness, right? And on the mixed theory, or on the desire satisfaction approach, desires figure into this, right? On the mixed theory, Jonas has a belief the dog is snarling and desires to run away, right? Of course, there's that missing link there, but don't worry about that for now. Similarly with Mary's cat, right? If Mary believes her cat is injured, and she further forms the belief that it's a life-threatening injury, she'll feel sadness because she desires not to lose the cat, right? So it's a combination of beliefs and desires, or it could also be a representation of how her desires are faring. Mary's cat is injured, so Mary has this standing desire to not lose her cat. And of course, the cat being injured frustrates that desire, and her sadness is her representation of that frustration. But on the evaluative judgment theory, we don't combine beliefs with desires. What we do is we combine them with other beliefs, other doxastic states, like axiological beliefs or evaluative beliefs, right? So here we don't make sense of Jonas's fear or Mary's sadness in terms of beliefs and desires interacting, or desires preceding emotions which signal the satisfaction or frustration of the desire. What we appeal to is a kind of interaction between Jonas's belief that the dog is snarling and his belief that because it's snarling, it is dangerous, or Mary's belief that her cat's death would be a loss, which follows her belief that her cat is injured, right? So beliefs play an important role, and not, this is quite strict because we're talking about beliefs in the doxastic sense and not just in the folk psychological sense, right? The authors put it this way on page 53. They say the crucial point here is that the beliefs now invoked are not neutral apprehensions of the world, but rather apprehended in evaluative terms. Since only such beliefs render the respective attributions of fear and sadness intelligible, adherents of the evaluative judgment theory identify each emotion type with beliefs involving a corresponding evaluative property. So that's nice. What are they saying here? They're saying that, not only are these beliefs not these neutral apprehensions in the way that the mixed theory had it, right? If Jonas believes this dog is snarling, how does he get from that to running away from the dog or feeling fear? We need more beliefs, right? So now we have those beliefs. Jonas believes the dog is snarling, and he believes that a snarling dog is dangerous. And then perhaps that causes him to run away in fear, right? And it also allows us to quite neatly categorize different emotion types, because each emotion type would have a corresponding evaluative property. And that's one of the principal virtues of this approach of the evaluative judgment theory. We can organize emotion types by means of particular evaluative properties. And that's just a complicated way of saying that if we're feeling a certain emotion, we're feeling it because the object of the emotion is exhibiting the relevant evaluative property. So maybe we can stop and think of some examples here. I'm just curious if anybody wants to volunteer an example or two. So just to reiterate, what this theory is saying is that if we feel an emotion, the object of the emotion, which can be a person or a scenario or an event or a piece of art, or it could be many things, but the object of the emotion exhibits the property that the emotion is meant to represent. Some answers in the chat. Okay, think about it. Yeah, take time. The slides are quite light today, so there's time to think and to discuss. So Leslie says, sorry, can you say that again? Okay, sure. Yeah. So if we feel an emotion, that's because the object of the emotion displays the right property. So let's try and clarify that. Or sorry, I should add, if we feel an emotion, it's because what the emotion is about, whatever that thing is, has the relevant property. And that in turn allows us to categorize emotions. So Isabella, let's try and cash this out by way of Isabella's example, which is love. Okay, so love is tricky because love is a very complicated emotion. But if we feel love, that is because the object of our love exhibits the right kinds of evaluative properties. And when it comes to something like love, I imagine that this could be quite complicated, right? So if it's like saying, if I love my partner, well, my partner is the object of my love, and my partner exhibits the relevant evaluative properties, right? Disgust is a simpler example for sure. That's another one that Isabella is offering. So disgust is pretty straightforward, because if I feel disgust, that's because the object that's disgusting me has the evaluative property of being disgusting, right? So that's quite straightforward. Stress response to a bear in the forest, like fear, like fright, right? Yeah, so exactly. Fright is another great example. Remember how we talked about emotions having formal objects, right? This is very much that. The formal object of fear would be danger. Fear represents danger. That formal object is also the evaluative property of the thing, right? So the evaluative property is what the object of your emotion has. So the bear has the property of being frightening. And then the formal object of your emotional episode is that the bear is dangerous because it is frightening. You're afraid of things that are dangerous, right? The fear, well, danger would be the formal object because that specifies the relation between you and the thing in the environment, namely the bear. Yeah, so the particular object would be the bear. The formal object would be, the formal object of your emotion would be danger, and the evaluative property that the bear has would be that it's frightening. So it's like a big web of complicated stuff. Really gets to the point of why emotions evolved. Imagine if you had to, like, if there was a bear in the woods and you had to stop and think about it, right? Yeah, exactly. It'd be hilariously bad. It would not be adaptive. So if you have to stop and think, oh, there's a bear, should I be afraid? Well, is it a fat bear or a thin bear or a polar bear, or what kind of bear is it? Is it a teddy bear? You know, like, you got to think about it. But if you just have an automatic reaction like bear, I'm afraid, get out of here, well, then you can survive and pass on your genes. And I just want to go up to Isabella's other example, which is shame, which is also a really good one, right? The object the emotion exhibits, the object of the emotion, if we feel shame, is that it's shameful or perhaps degrading in some way, right? So, you know, shame is an interesting emotion because also it's a moral emotion. And the object of shame could be not something necessarily concrete, but perhaps some action you've taken, right? If you've, you know, I mean, the example that that I always go to, which is of course not something that's very likely to happen in real life, but, you know, people have dreams. They have anxiety dreams where maybe they've got to go give a speech. So they have a dream where they're going to go give a speech or something. But in the dream, they discover that they have no clothes on, right? And, you know, other people are seeing you in a way that you don't want them to see you, and that you suddenly realize you have no control over. And shame is kind of, you know, that kind of an emotion, right? It's the opposite of pride, right? So those are all very good examples. Let's just see, nothing else in the chat. So those are good examples. So yeah, if we feel an emotion, the object of the emotion has the relevant evaluative property. So disgusting things have the property of being disgusting. You know, shameful things have the property of being shameful. Very simple. I've already said the evaluative properties of the objects or of the, you know, of the objects of our emotion are actually the formal objects of the emotions themselves. So I already said that. I know it's kind of hard to get this across in a straightforward way, but this just means, you know, as Chelsea was asking in the chat, for example, that the evaluative property, you know, that the bear is frightening, that fright represents danger, which is the formal object of my emotional response, but the evaluative property belongs to the object causing the emotional response. So this is great because we can categorize emotions this way, right? Anger is all about somebody offending you or trying to harm you or committing an injustice. Fright is all about danger and dangerous things and avoiding harm. You know, sadness is all about loss, right? So this helps us not only categorize the emotions, but it's very beneficial because it helps us to also specify justification and correctness conditions for emotions, right? And I think the example, like if we go back to the example of Mary's cat, you know, there are justification and correctness conditions for her sadness, right? If Mary believes her cat is injured, then you know, she is justified in feeling sad if she has a good reason to believe her cat is injured. But she could be incorrect. Perhaps she has some justification But really her cat's fine. It's at the vet making a full recovery, and she just hasn't been told that. Well, in that case, her sadness would be incorrect, even though perhaps one could make the argument that it's justified, right? And in this way, emotions, as I said earlier in earlier classes, emotions are a bit like beliefs in this way, in that they have justification and correctness conditions, and that they have a mind to world direction of fit, right? Another cool virtue about the EJT account is that it might help us to account for links between emotion on the one hand and, oh, excuse me, can't stop yawning today. Yeah, it might help us to account for links between emotion on the one hand and motivation on the other hand. How does it do that? Well, there are two options. Option one would be to combine EJT with what is called motivation internalism. So what is motivation internalism? Well, motivation internalism says that evaluative judgments are essentially motivating. And this is a characteristic that motivation internalists say that, you know, factual judgments don't have, right? So for example, if I judge the snarling dog as dangerous, that's a value judgment. I'm saying I'm evaluating the dog as a dangerous thing in my environment. And just by virtue of having done that, I'm also motivated to run away, right? That's what motivation internalism would say about evaluative judgment. Evaluative judgments are just essentially motivating in a way that factual judgments aren't. You know, like if I'm trying to make a factual judgment about what's a good example? Factual judgment. I need a factual judgment example. Say whether it is correct that the moon is out. Well, I don't know. In order to make that judgment, I have to be motivated to go out and look at the sky, though. So, yeah. I'm not sure. Does anyone else have an example? Let's see. Chat.
I'm gonna speak if that's okay, because I'm doing dishes.
Yeah, fine. Oh, multitasking, great.
I think like a factual judgment, something to do with, we could think about, like if it's really cold, I'm gonna be motivated. Like this is a fact that it's really cold, so I'm gonna be motivated to make myself warmer. Perhaps. No.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to disentangle factual judgments from evaluative judgments sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, they don't really provide an example of a factual judgment to clarify this, but then again, perhaps the reason they don't do that is because they actually don't think that motivational internalism is correct. So they don't
consistent with their method.
Yeah, exactly. They just don't build a straw man and knock it over, right? They just say, it's probably not true, right? Because the reason it's probably not true is because we can make a judgment that something has the relevant evaluative property without being motivated in the relevant way, right?
Okay.
The example in the book is of walking down the dark alley that you believe is dangerous. And this speaks to me, like, you know, I used to work at a restaurant that was near a homeless shelter. And it's not that the clients of the shelter were dangerous, but there was a lot of, like, you know, drug dealing going on. And sometimes fights break out. You know, you don't want to get caught in the middle of any of it. So I can judge that, you know, walking home from where I used to work might be a little risky, but I'm not motivated to avoid my usual route, right? Or even just forget that there might be shady people around. Like, I can judge that crossing the street is risky, but I'm not motivated to never cross a street, right? Any other examples? I mean, another one might be like art. Perhaps you can judge that, you know, a painting is admirable without being motivated to you know, go see admirable art all the time. I don't, something like that. So just the fact that there's a sort of decoupling between making evaluative judgments and being motivated to act on those judgments. We can decouple those, and that fact alone poses a big problem for motivation internalism. So it doesn't look like option number one is very good so far for helping to clarify the links between emotion and motivation. What other problems exist with it? Well, according to the authors, it also can't account for emotions that aren't tied to action. And remember, there are a lot of emotions that are not tied to action, right? Emotions directed at the past, like regret or nostalgia, particularly nostalgia. Although, I don't know, you can always kind of come up with a counterexample. My nostalgia might be tied to actions like popping on an old movie that I liked when I was younger, right?
I think, can I just say that this makes me think about like the therapeutic implications of how we encourage people in therapy to take a step back from their emotions, because sometimes in the case of, say, like there's some sort of neuroticism going on or psychopathology, right? People are so inclined to just act on the emotion. I
Right.
think it's a really great, you know, we kind of see even more that it's possible that the emotions can exist and they are not just going to be motivating us to be doing something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I think this is a focus I've noticed in you know, like cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, where you have like some people will call it, you know, there's different terms, but one way that I'm familiar with is like your hot thought, right? This is the
Mm-hmm.
thing that causes your anxiety or your fear.
Sure. Yeah.
And you have to learn to step back and, you know, you say to yourself like, well, look, that's my old lizard brain running the show,
Yeah.
right? But I've got my frontal lobes here, and so I got to step back and actually think like, is my emotion correct or justified? Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's,
So
yeah, acceptance and commitment therapy too. So that's another one where you take a moment to just accept the stimuli and also the emotion, and then committing to how you'd want to deal with it. Oops, sorry.
yeah, it all reminds me a little bit of Taoism. You know, life is a river and you're going with the flow, or Stoicism too.
So is it, yeah. So
And
many ways we can pull philosophy into psychology.
oh, exactly. It's fantastic. Which is why it's good to study or philosophy, or if you're a you know, or if you're a philosopher, to know about science.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
So
Okay.
yeah, so that's one problem with this internalism option, right? Emotions are not always intimately tied to action. And as you just pointed out, Chelsea, there might be some instances where we don't want our emotions tied to action, right? Because maybe that anxiety is going to make you do something that is going to make the situation worse. So you got to decouple that. And of course, we can judge something has the relevant property without being motivated in the relevant way. Actually, okay, I've got a great example for that one. I have this friend from this very same restaurant I used to work at, and he's an interesting fella. He's an interesting guy. He's just kind of exciting. Not really. Well, yeah, really. It was a Tim Hortons. It's not a happy place to be. But this guy I used to work with, you know, I won't say his name. I don't want to. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody here, but he is a little slow. You know, he's not dumb, but he doesn't take time to think things through sometimes, right? You know, I'm inspired to do this because today he sent me some COVID-19 misinformation and I had to be like, why? No, this is wrong. But anyway, he drives a car. I don't drive. I don't have a driver's license. I don't drive. He drives a car. I've gotten rides home from work with him. We shoot the breeze, talk about work, you know, fun guy to talk to. But he drives like a maniac. And he knows that doing this has the evaluative property of being dangerous, right? He's been in, I don't know, like 6 car accidents. It's amazing that he's still alive. He knows, I would say, that it's dangerous to do what he does, but he is not motivated to drive in the right way, you know? So there we go. That's one example. Yeah, I agree. Oh my God, it's correct. And Hayden, you're right. Working at Tim Hortons is not, I mean, one does what one has to do, right? You know, if you want to go to grad school and pay for your tuition, maybe you'll work at a terrible job, right? Maybe even though I know this job is terrible, I won't quit. You know, that might be related to some of this this emotion stuff here. But yeah, but that's the example I can think about. People who flaunt danger, you know, like daredevils and stuff, or my friend who just drives like a maniac. There's you know, that's a kind of example. Oh, of course, teenagers. Well, when you're a teenager, you think you know everything and you're invincible, right? Yeah, exactly. Your brain's not done. Not until you're like 25. It's a little different. I mean, there are obviously individual differences, and I think it might be a little bit later for males. But yeah, your brain's not finished developing. So that might explain why sometimes there's this disconnect. Things aren't working exactly the way they're meant to work after all of that neural pruning and stuff is done, right? So anyway, we're getting into some neuroscience here, which is fun, but I'm not a neuroscientist. So let's talk about another option, which is to take on considerations which we've already looked at, but which led us to reject cognitive approaches to explaining the link between emotion and motivation. So one of these approaches is that a good theory about the link between emotion and motivation has to do justice to the explanatory links between emotions and desires. So we shouldn't conflate emotions with desires, right? They're two different things. It's confusing, eh? I hope I'm making the difference clear when I pronounce it. Sometimes I trip over my words, but yeah, there are conative states which have to do with motivation. So desiring, willing, cognitive is to do with thinking. Yeah, because conative is just, I'm going to say it in the most confusing way possible, but conative is cognate with conatus, and cognitive is cognate with cogitas. That means that those two pairs of words are of the same blood, but conative and cognitive are different. So just to make sure that's clear.
That's Latin that just keeps giving us gifts, or is that Greek?
That's Latin. Yeah. When something is cognate, it means of the same blood. So when I talk about cognates, I'm talking about words that descended from a common ancestor word. And I bring that up sometimes because we are doing ordinary language philosophy here, right? But conatus is like a blind striving, like willing, desiring, an urge. These are all conative states. You know, an appetite, you want to get something to eat, right? It's all conative states, whereas cognitive is cogitas, thinking, right?
When you say ordinary language philosophy, is there like spicy language philosophy? What's the
Okay.
alternative? Is it just logic,
I mean, kind of. Well, logic. Okay, so here's the thing. So
like symbolic? Sorry, yeah.
yeah, ordinary language philosophy is like an approach that really got going in the early 20th century, and what it says is, and you have like people like Wittgenstein to thank for this. Really, is that a lot of philosophical problems are actually the result of taking words out of their normal context, right?
Okay.
Like normally when we talk about beliefs and
Oh,
desires,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
we're doing it like as people who have them, right?
Mhm.
That's what we're doing here with emotions. You know, we're not being like, the necessary and sufficient conditions for an emotion is blah, blah,
Mhm.
blah, right? We're not doing that. We're doing an ordinary language approach, which means we're looking at how we use the words, which tells us about how we think about the words. It tells us about those concepts, right? And it doesn't take them out of their regular context, right?
Right.
Like, you know, it's like Wittgenstein said, the meaning of a word is its use in the language game,
Right. Yes, yes.
right?
Yeah.
It's not something we stipulate with axioms and premises. It's not that. It's something we do.
Right.
So when we take language, when we take words out of that context, we create problems that aren't really there,
We have
you know?
nothing. Yeah.
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 So
Okay. Okay, that makes more sense. You've said it a number of times, and I've been trying to figure out what wouldn't be ordinary language philosophy, and I just wanted
yeah.
to decide. So thank you.
Yeah. So that's what it is. And it's a really cool approach. I mean, I'm no specialist in it, but it's kind of one of those things I think I've kind of been doing without realizing it. Just because I spent grad school kind of in the getting more acquainted with that analytic tradition, which is where it comes from. So yeah.
Yeah, analytic philosophy has definitely come to be something I've appreciated more
Yeah.
than than continental for that reason.
I mean, and I don't want to say there's anything wrong with continental philosophy. A lot of people have an irrational hate on for it that I really don't understand. The problem is with continental philosophy, it's less structured, and the well, upshot or downshot of that, depending on who you are, is that you actually kind of have to think a little harder about it. There are other criticisms we can level against it. You know, there's the whole social text affair and that whole thing, but no, I don't think one is superior to the other. I think there are different ways of getting at the same problems.
Really? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm gonna pick your brain about that at some point.
Yeah, because I don't know, and it depends who you're reading. It also depends who you're reading.
Hmm.
But in a lot of ways, the distinction is just arbitrary. Like, I mean, who's continental? Is Kant continental or is he analytical? Like, come
Yeah.
on, you
Okay.
know?
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, we're talking about how we need a good theory of the emotions, which would be good because it does justice to the explanatory links between desires and emotions. So we don't want to conflate these kinds of states, right? Emotions are not desires. Emotions are emotions, and desires are a type of cognitive state. So how do the authors kind of flesh this out? They say, the present theory has a ready answer, you know, to how we can avoid this. The subject possesses such a desire because she judges that these works of art are admirable, or in other words, because she admires them. That is to say, emotions can now be regarded as reasons for certain desires without having a strict constitutive relation to them. Those emotions that are not intimately linked to action will, for their part, not engender any desire. So basically, the nutshell, what we're trying to talk about in a nutshell here on this slide, is that we want to keep emotions and desires separate. Remember, the mixed theory takes desires along with beliefs to be constitutive of emotions. We don't want to do that. We want to say they're separate because of the problems we saw with the mixed theory and the desire, satisfaction, frustration approach. So Here, desires become reasons, or rather emotions become reasons for certain desires, but the desires are not part of the emotion. They follow from the emotion. So Jonas feels fear and then forms the desire to run away from the frightening stimulus. So emotions and desires are linked, and this gives us a nice link to emotion and motivation as well, but it doesn't make desires part of the emotion. Everybody see what I mean?
Yes, and it seems intuitive, but I feel like they're about to make us feel bad for committing to anything that they say.
Exactly. There are still problems.
Yeah.
Like, we're not even halfway through the first half of the chapter, and it's looking like, oh, EJT looks pretty promising, but, wait for it. There's a reason. Yeah, there's a reason why it's not. So what is that reason? Maybe it's on the next slide. Well, yep, we've got some nice virtues of the evaluative judgment theory, but there are problems. So just to answer the desires follow from emotions. Yes, Alexa, on the evaluative judgment theory, emotions become reasons for the desires we have. So if I'm afraid of the snarling dog, I form a desire to run away from the snarling dog, like that. So yeah, but that's on this account. Other accounts have it differently. But on this account, the emotions as value judgments account, desires are like sort of follow from emotions, as you suggest here. So yeah, that's correct. So problems. Well, the basic problem, yeah, no problem. The basic problem with emotions, with the evaluative judgment theory, is pretty simple. As the authors say, as has often been repeated in the literature on the subject, an evaluative belief is neither necessary nor sufficient for an emotion. Uh-oh. Necessity and sufficiency. Do we even do that anymore? Apparently, it's funny that we're doing this in a book on ordinary language philosophy, but
excited.
Yeah, so what is necessity and sufficiency? I want to see myself talk, but I don't want to be in the way, so do that. So who's familiar with necessity and sufficiency, and who is not? Maybe if I go over here. Got an answer in the chat. So Chelsea's familiar. Surely some others are familiar. Oh, so Gracie, this is new to you. Okay. Rowan's heard of it. Great. So I'm going to go through a good example. Yeah, it looks like some people are familiar and some are not. Okay. So necessity and sufficiency are all part of what we call the there was something I missed in the chat there. Yeah. I'll be honest, Alexa, and everybody else. I'm not even that interested in, doing logic and stuff, where you might write this all out on a chalkboard, your P's and Q's and R's and S's. Chelsea, okay, you're a fan. I mean, it's not like I hate it, but it's just like, I don't know. I'm so much more of a verbal person, right? I guess that's why I like the ordinary language approach. But necessity and sufficiency have to do with what is called the classical view of concepts. So I just keep checking the cat. Yeah, that's the nice thing, is if you can use some kind of logical calculus, what's happening, then it does make things clear. So classical view of concepts. What are concepts? Concepts are mental items. Concepts are the building blocks of thought. They're not always called concepts in every discipline. In philosophy, we like to talk about concepts. In psychology, depending on who you're talking to, you might talk about concepts. You might talk about schemas. You might talk about prototypes. There's any number of things, any number of ways to understand this, but philosophers understand concepts as building blocks of thought. So you have concepts for everything, right? If you're familiar with like Plato, Plato would talk about the forms as if they were real objects that existed in some kind of, noumenal level of existence or something. The forms are also very much like concepts, right? Except concepts exist in the mind. Same with where Aristotle talks about particulars and universals. You could think of universals as concepts. I mean, I have a concept of a cup. It's a thing, it holds liquid, you drink out of it. Concept of a cup right here. Well, this is a real actual cup, but in my mind, I have a concept of a cup. I don't have just concepts for concrete things, but I have concepts for abstract things like justice or something like that, right? I have a concept of justice. So there are concepts for everything. And concepts are how we build thought, right? Concepts are what we plug in to that logical calculus. If Josh believes that P, as we'll see in a moment, just understanding a statement like that requires a mastery of so many concepts, right? So concepts are important. And the classical view of concepts is that how we define them are through certain conditions, certain necessary and sufficient conditions. Now, what is necessity and what is sufficiency? Well, they're two different things, but necessity is basing the following. I like to explain it with this example. Necessity is where A is necessary for B, where B cannot be true unless A is true. It's necessary for A to be true, for B to be true. Now, I know some of us like, our A's and B's and P's and Q's, but if you're more verbal like myself, think of this example. Being a fruit is a necessary condition for being an apple. You cannot be an apple. I have an invisible apple here, apparently. You cannot be an apple unless you are first a fruit, right? Nor could you be a banana. So being a fruit is a necessary condition for being an apple or a banana or a tomato. I know a lot of people think of them as vegetables, but they're really fruits. Everybody knows that. What about sufficiency? Well, sufficiency. Oh, was somebody about to say something? I heard a mic go unmuted there. Maybe I'm hearing things. So that's necessity. A is necessary for B, where B can't be true unless A is true. Actually, before we get to sufficiency, can anyone think of some examples of necessity? Well, let's change it up from fruits to vegetables. It is necessary, being a vegetable is a necessary condition for being broccoli, right? You can't be broccoli unless you're a vegetable. What about something that's a little bit more abstract? Can anyone think of something? Well, this is kind of like an empirical kind of thing. Like, is it necessary for the sun to exist for life? Like, to be alive? Well, I would say probably not, because there are creatures that don't require sunlight to live. There are some, like plants, for example, they need the sun because they need that sunlight to drive photosynthesis. So they can take that CO2 and all the stuff from the ground and turn it into sugar, right? So they need the sun. But there are those tube worms that live by like underwater volcanic vents, and they don't need the sun at all. They use the heat and the chemicals coming out of these vents to make their food, right? So this is an empirical thing. We're not really dealing with empirical things. We're dealing with concepts, remember? Yeah. So you cannot have scored unless you've shot a basketball. Again, that's a bit empirical, but I see where you're going. Like, no score cannot be a shot taken, right? Like if the basketball picked itself up for some reason and shot itself into the net, that wouldn't be a score, right? Is it necessary to have a frontal lobe to have emotion? Well, again, that's empirical, but yeah, it is tricky, but that's empirical. But also, no, it probably isn't necessary because you know, other animals that don't have as highly developed frontal lobes probably have some kind of basic emotion, perhaps limited. I don't know if crocodiles, for example, experience joy, but they probably experience a primitive version of, aggression or fear, depending on the situation. But yeah. So we're talking about claims, we're talking about concepts, we're talking about propositions, not necessarily things in the world, right?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
How? I was gonna say like another thing, like it's necessary to be an animal to be a cat.
Yeah.
But how is that different? Like, and the same with your fruit one. How is this different from like what we've said here? How is that
Well,
less empirical, I guess, is my question.
when I'm treating these examples like, being a fruit is a necessary condition for being an apple, I'm focused on the proposition,
Okay.
whereas a lot of like what's in the proposition, lots of concepts, fruits,
Oh,
necessity, apples, these are all concepts, right? And they're all connected together with language that, and all of this tells us what the sentence is saying,
okay.
right? But a question like, for example, Riley asked, is it necessary to have a frontal lobe to have emotions? That might actually be an empirical question that we could answer it, but it's not something we do by writing it down on a chalkboard and arguing about it, right? We'd actually go out into the world and look, right? Because we're
Oh,
talking about things in the world, right?
okay.
So
So could it be like it's necessary for you to be in Ontario if you're in Ottawa kind of thing? Would that be
well, you cannot be in Ottawa unless you are in Ontario. So yeah, that's a good example,
okay.
like, but what we're concerned here is not particular details about Ottawa or Ontario, but sort of like logical relations between
Right.
the
Yeah.
concepts that we have. If I
Right.
know Ontario is a province in Canada, and I
Mhm.
also know that Ottawa is a city in the province of Ontario, then I
Right.
can reason all this out just completely a priori, right?
Right. You don't need the empirical because there's
Exactly.
nothing in the actual world that really like if we didn't exist kind of thing. Like if we didn't put the labels on it, there would be no one to like there's no natural rock that's just saying this is Ottawa in Ontario kind of thing. Like this is a concept that we have put onto the like the natural world kind of thing.
Yeah. In fact, Rowan's got a really good example here. So is it necessary for you to be male to be my brother? Yes, that is necessary. But it's not sufficient,
Right.
right? And that's where we're going next, is sufficiency, because sometimes things can be necessary and not sufficient, or sufficient but not necessary, or necessary and sufficient. And we want the last one, necessary and sufficient. So what is sufficiency? Well, X is sufficient for Y when you know X to be true, and that's adequate grounds to conclude that Y is true. So the example that I've put here is that knowing that Elizabeth II is a queen is sufficient to conclude she's a woman, right? Because that's a priori, queens are women, Then it depends on the context, right? If I were to say that RuPaul Charles is a queen, that would not be sufficient to conclude that RuPaul is a woman, right? Because he's a drag queen. So, and I know that there are, cisgendered female and transgender female drag queens, and I'm not ruling out the possibility that there could be monarchs of the same variety as well. I'm just saying that it's the logical relations, right, that determine whether we've got those necessary and sufficient conditions. So does everybody follow me there? Exactly, exactly. Because a male could be not your brother, could be your father or your uncle or your neighbor, right? All right. You know, being male is a necessary condition for being a brother, but being a brother and being a brother is also sufficient to conclude that person is male, right? So these are necessary and sufficient conditions. So we'll go on from there now. So we've got necessity claims and sufficiency claims as part of the EJT. I wonder how many slides we've got left. Oh, not much. Good. This is perfect. Okay, so the necessity claim is for on the EJT is saying that emotions necessarily imply evaluative beliefs, right? To have an emotion, you need an evaluative judgment or an evaluative belief. That's the necessity claim. And there's reasons to doubt that. One reason is that we can experience an emotion without the accompanying value judgment, right? Jonas might be afraid of spiders, and maybe a tiny spider comes along, like a little wolf spider. You know, they're harmless, and he's afraid. But he knows the spider is harmless, right? So he's experiencing the emotion, but he doesn't have the value judgment that that spider is dangerous. Yet he still feels fear. And this seems to pose a problem for the necessity claim, because the necessity claim is saying, you know, to have that emotion, fear, you need to also have that value judgment that that's dangerous. That thing that's making me afraid is dangerous. But we can be afraid without that value judgment. So that's the problem there. What are you barking at? You know, and even if we were to try to hold on to this idea, how would we save it? How would we save the necessity claim? We'd have to say that Jonas has conflicting beliefs. You know, he's consciously, you know, believes the spider is harmless, but unconsciously or implicitly he believes that it is harmful, and that's why he's afraid. So is he being irrational? I don't really think this is as big of a problem as the authors make it out to be, because you know, people go through this all the time, right? This is cognitive dissonance, right? We do this all the time, and maybe we are irrational when we do it. I don't know, but we can entertain two opposing beliefs. People do that all the time, often without realizing that their beliefs are actually in conflict. So what do the authors have to say about it? Well, they say on page 55, conceiving of emotions as involving the attitude of belief, that is, holding a proposition true, is clearly problematic. It simply does not seem correct to regard those situations in which one believes that a given evaluative property is not exemplified, yet undergoes the relevant emotion, as similar to situations in which one holds contradictory beliefs. Okay, so what are they saying there? Well, they seem to be saying that if we're thinking of emotions as involving beliefs, which they certainly seem to, you know, beliefs about propositions, true beliefs, or beliefs that propositions are true, rather, you know, thinking of emotions as involving those kinds of pro attitudes is problematic, because it doesn't seem quite right. You know, if we have a situation where, you know, somebody does not believe the evaluative property is exemplified, yet undergoes the emotion, you know, that's not quite the same thing as situations in which one does say hold contradictory beliefs, right? Like the contradictory belief. What are some contradictory beliefs, just so that we can cash this out by way of example? Let's see. Yeah, that's yeah, I understand. Yeah. Well, that's a good example because those are quite clearly beliefs in the sense that folk psychology talks about, like it's an attitude toward a proposition that I'd have to consciously endorse, right? But Jonas being afraid of the spider isn't really like that, you know. He does say, oh, I know the spider's not harmful, but I'm still being afraid. I'm still afraid. So it must not be conflicting beliefs, right? Must be something else. So that's one reason to doubt this. Second reason, maybe we can avoid this problem altogether by thinking of emotions, not in terms of doxastic states, which are quite rigorous, but in terms of less committed propositional attitudes. And this is how we can make sense of Jonas's response. You know, maybe Jonas doesn't have to believe the dog is dangerous or the spider is dangerous, right? But he could entertain the idea that they're dangerous, or maybe construe or even misconstrue them as dangerous, right? And in this way, you have a sort of difference between your beliefs and your perceptions, right? Oh, sorry, I'm just replying to a message here. So, you know, my favorite example of this kind of way of explaining things is one that I tried to develop when I was talking about what eeriness is, when I was looking into the uncanny valley phenomenon, right? And without going too far into all the detail, I tried to argue that it was a type of anxiety. Anxiety is, of course, uncertainty. It's all about uncertainty. It's a type of fright that has uncertainty or uncertainty about something as its object. And in the case of the uncanny valley, it seemed to me that, you know, when you look at a very realistic human-like artifact, you have the belief, you usually walk into the room with the belief that it's just a machine, right? It's an inanimate object. Robots, holograms, whatever, they're inanimate objects. They're not alive. We kind of come into the room with that belief. Or even a wax figure, like if you've been to the wax museums and seen a wax figure, you know they're not alive. But there are features of their appearance, or perhaps if we're talking about robots or animatronics, features of their movement that we perceive and feel phenomenologically similar to perceiving things that are alive. So we have a belief, this thing is lifeless, it's a machine, it's not alive, it doesn't think, versus perceptions of an apparently animate thinking being. And that can make us feel a bit weird, right? So that's an example of perhaps less committed pro attitudes, right? But there are other problems. You know, this doesn't help us avoid the problems entirely. There are other problems with the necessity claim. The authors say, again, on page 55, second problem is attributing beliefs or construals, and a fortiori attributing a value to beliefs or construals might still be thought of as too demanding with regard to the cognitive capacities the subject is required to display, right? What does that mean? A fortiori. I always have trouble with that. What does that mean? Anybody want to take a shot at it? That's not a bad guess. Yeah, that's not a bad guess. A fortiori means that there is, if you've got like one proposition or claim or argument, there might be something else implicit and true in what you've already said. So you know, it's like if I have the emotion, an EJT person would a fortiori attribute an evaluative belief to me because I have that emotion, right? Because they say, oh, emotions are evaluative beliefs. And if I say like, oh, Josh has emotion A, that means he has evaluative belief B, right? So that's what that means, just roughly in sort of, you know, everyday language. What do they mean? Well, this might be, you know, too demanding with regard to the cognitive capacities the subject is required to exploit. Well, you know, it's like I said earlier, we need to have mastered the concepts present in the relevant propositions, right, in order to have an emotion, if emotions are also value judgments, right? But is that right? Like, I mean, the example in the book is quite comical. There's one, you know, Jonas believes Mary's scarf is alpaca wool or something like that. And to evaluate that, you need to know what wool is, what a scarf is, what alpacas are. You need to know a lot of things. You need to have mastered other concepts, right? Because emotions just always are also evaluative beliefs or value judgments, right? We need to be able to master concepts in the way that someone who could understand that sentence about the alpaca wool scarf could understand that. But this would imply that infants and animals don't experience emotions, right? If we have to have such a high level of mastery of these concepts. And most of us just wouldn't countenance that claim, right? It's obvious that infants experience basic emotions, as do certain non-human animals, right? So this seems to just not be very sensible if you countenance the idea that infants and animals have emotions. Okay, the last important slide before we wrap up, and this is all about the sufficiency claim. The sufficiency claim of EJT is quite simple, or rather the challenge to the sufficiency claim is quite simple. One can have the kind of evaluative belief that the theory invokes without having the corresponding emotion. Very simple. So remember, according to EJT, emotions a fortiori are value judgments too, right? But we can have the right kind of evaluative belief without experiencing an emotion. Are there any examples we can think of? I read a paper. Oh, there's something in the chat. The shirt is too blue. Yeah, that's an evaluative belief, but I mean, yeah, that is an example. You can have a value judgment without an emotion about the blueness of a shirt. But is that the kind of evaluative belief that the emotion as value judgment theory invokes? I don't think it is. Yeah, it's a good shot. It's a good shot. I read a paper once. Okay, and this is going to get maybe a little bit weird. So apologies in advance, you know, if this is weird, but I read a paper once on shame. I don't remember the author. I just don't remember the author. Might have actually been Putnam or Harmon, some old analytic guy. Anyway, it was about shame, and how shame, you know, shame can be weaponized against people. You know, shame is kind of like the opposite of pride. So if you think, for example, you know, like if you go to like a pride parade, you know, it's pride, celebrate, yay, it's great, you know, we're proud of who we all are, all the LGBTQ folks and all their allies, they're all happy and proud, right? And that's a good thing. But shame can be weaponized to make people feel bad too, you know. A lot of those people at the pride parade might have at some point in the past been made to feel shame about who they are, right? And that's a bad use of shame. We shouldn't make people feel ashamed for the ways they are, right? But maybe there's a case to be made about making people feel shame over their actions, right? You know, we do this with children. Like if you know, if a couple siblings are fighting and I don't know, one of them hits the other one, maybe the parents will say you should be ashamed of yourself because you've done something that you're just not supposed to do. You're not supposed to be that way, right? So there's a use for shame, but there's also a sort of weaponized form of shame, which is bad, right? Shame is a moral emotion is good, but shame as a weapon to attack people is bad. So shame has a function, but the author said something at some point in the paper, like talking about shame, and it was a very apropos example. It was, one wonders, I'm trying to quote from memory, one wonders how porn stars do it, right? Sorry about the pun, how porn stars do it. You know, taking your clothes off and you know, having sex in front of other people is probably something that most of us would feel ashamed to do, right? Because it violates social convention. Yet there are those adult film stars, perhaps people in the kink community, that don't experience the shame, even though they might be perfectly willing to you know, to countenance the you know, to accept the proposition that, you know, taking your clothes off and getting freaky in public is perhaps something you most people would feel shame over, right? It's just not something we do. So that's my example of how you could have the belief, like, yeah, I can see, you know, it might be shameful or embarrassing to be naked and doing that sort of thing in front of people. And yet there are people who do not experience that, right? So I don't know. That's the example I thought of. But are there any maybe like less far out, more close to home examples? There must be. I'm wondering if any of you can come up with some.
Can I speak this one again? My hands are still tied up with dishes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm doing them really slowly because I'm trying to write things down while we're doing this. But if we were to talk about, I guess, shame, embarrassment, kind of, but I know with something like, this is like sense of humor. So being silly, there are some people, like I can be quite silly in front of other people in public, and I have friends of mine who will look at me and go like, how are you not embarrassed right now? And to me it's just like, well, I'm just having a good time, like I don't care.
That's a really good example.
Okay.
Yeah, because, well, continue. You sounded like you had a couple further things to say.
No, that's all
Oh, okay. But yeah, that is a good example, and I can kind of relate to I can kind of I get that because I've done that too. Sometimes I'll do things that might, if someone else were to do them, they would feel embarrassed, but
Yeah.
I'll do them because it's embarrassing to somebody I like who I'm hanging out with, and I just get a kick out of it.
Yeah.
Like if my girlfriend and I are shopping, I did this once where you know, she was busy shopping and there were these lettered dish towels, and I rearranged them all to spell silly words. And she was just like, oh my god, like, what are you doing? And I was like, I'm a PhD candidate,
Having a good time. Yeah.
yeah. So, you know, yeah, that's a good example. I can relate to that. And Rowan has an example, like dark humor. Some people find things funny even though it's morally questionable. Yeah, that's a really good example. I mean, there are some pretty dark you know, what is it? It's called it's black comedy. It's called black comedy when things are really pessimistic and horrible, but somehow still funny, right? And yeah, I mean, one could make an argument that that's the way that you know, perhaps we can even cope with dark things that happen to ourselves by finding what's funny about them. Let's see. I'm actually having trouble thinking of an example. Because as we were talking to last time, a lot of the comedians that I used to enjoy have said some problematic things. And geez, what's a good example? I can't think of. Oh, there's a great example. I can't remember the special, but Bo Burnham has a good special where he's singing a song about mental health and how, like, if you have mental health, you shouldn't joke about it. You should go see help. If you have mental health problems, but if you're trying to solve your problems by listening to like Firework by Katy Perry, you should just kill yourself, you know. And obviously that's a horrible thing to say, but in that context it was funny. I can't reproduce the joke because I'm not you know, that funny, but that's an example. And then yeah, Riley's got another example, like, yeah, you hate needles, but some people like tattoos, right? They would shy away from perhaps getting a vaccination. Maybe they need a friend to come with them for that, but to get a tattoo, maybe no big deal, right? I don't like needles or tattoos, but I guess needles aren't that bad. But I don't know, maybe tattoos would be fine. I don't have one. So skydiving, yeah, skydiving, we can evaluate that that's dangerous, but do it anyway and get a brush, right? That's what I probably might explain my friend who knows that driving the way he does is dangerous, and yet he still does it. Now, it's 9 o'clock and people are starting to leave. So I got to wrap this up. Okay, so Anna asks, yes, I'm going to have those done probably tomorrow or Thursday. Or no, tomorrow or Wednesday, those marks will be available to you. Sorry for going so long here, but the key takeaway here is, oh, tomorrow is Wednesday. Okay, I'm gonna have them all done tomorrow. So Thursday evening or no, Wednesday evening or Thursday morning. Yes, that's right. Okay, before we go, the point here, and this is kind of what I mentioned at the beginning, is that emotions are felt, right? And if we can have a belief without feeling the emotion, that's a problem for the sufficiency claim, because it seems to ignore, the sufficiency claim of this theory completely ignores that emotions have phenomenology, which is the bloody thing that we started the book about, right? Like, emotions have phenomenology. There's something that it's like to have them. The mixed theory also suffers from this kind of problem. And, you know, EJT and the mixed theory each claim that emotions are a combination of beliefs and desires, but they don't pay attention to or try to account for the phenomenology of emotions. And that's what's ultimately wrong with this approach, according to Deonna and Teroni. So that's it for the first bit of chapter 5. Next time, we're going to look at the rest of it. We're going to look at the add-on strategy, which also has some problems. It's got some solutions, but also problems. Then we look at emotions as constructions. Constructionism will actually turn out to be like a reversed or mirror image of the add-on strategy, and it's something that might give the authors what they're looking for. And then, of course, we'll conclude, and then that'll be it for this week. All right, so that is all. Thank you all for sticking with me. Sorry that I went over time. Good luck with the grading, Chelsea. Thanks, everybody. Thank you all for your participation this time. I get whether it's voice or in the chat. I love the participation. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night, and I'll see you next time. And I'll have those grades ready for you Thursday morning, come hell or high water. All right. Bye.